My name is Mark Norton. I'm the Product Director for Idiom. I'll be your host for this presentation, so let's begin.
Our presentation today will take us through the process of getting started with the Idiom Decision Manager. By getting started, we mean that it will take you from a blank slate through to your first decision model. The topic is the Idiom Light pricing model. This is the actual pricing model used on the Idiom website, which you'll be familiar with if you're an Idiom Light user. Now, the first step in any decisioning approach is to consider the key decision or decisions. In this case, how much should we charge? That leads us immediately to what decisions do I need to make in order to determine that? Well, in this case, we need to know how much new code there is versus how much repeat code, whether there's a free period, etc. Now, this PowerPoint, along with the actual repository for the Idiom Light pricing and the schema, etc., are all available in our resources library on our website. So you'll be able to follow this through and rebuild it at your leisure if you should choose to do so. So what we're going to do in this presentation is just get you started on that process. There is no need to follow through on all of this, of course, but if you wanted to do so, the resources will be available. So let's just get started. The first thing is to have some form of fact model. You can see our fact model here is a reasonably comprehensive series of nested collections. The collection we're most interested in is this generated code element here, and you can see its attributes. Now, this is quite a well-developed fact model. Generally, you would build the fact model up with the decision model, and the benefit of that is that it gives you a provably correct and properly constructed fact model, but we've done this in the interest of speed. I have, however, left out one attribute here so we can come back and update it, as you would in the normal course of building a decision model. So let's get started then. Now, as I promised, a blank slate. We even have the slate color, and I'm going to build a new repository. Now, I'm just going to stick with the default naming so that we don't have to sit around while I type. I'm not a good typist. Now, the first thing we need to do is to get hold of that schema. And here it is here. Once we've imported the schema, we customize it. Now, the customizing of a schema is what we do to define the contract, if you like, between the decision designer and the outside world. The first thing we do is determine how much of the schema will be visible to the decision designer, and in this case it's all. The next thing we have to concern ourselves with is what fields we allow them to output to. In other words, we give them control of the values in these fields, these nodes, and they will update them with the decision model. So that's all we need to do there. We now have a customized schema, and we'll add it to the repository, and we're ready for our first decision model. Now, we need to add it to the decision model. There can be many decision models in this repository, and they don't all have to use this schema. Similarly, we can have many schemas on the decision model. As I mentioned, we're going to be particularly interested in this element here, and I've just pulled on a decision group. A decision group is just going to give us context over that, and it will give us access to all of the generated code elements. Now, I'm nesting another decision group beneath that on the same element, and the purpose of that is that I want to actually run with two contexts here. I want a selected one, which is the one that's not priced, and I also need access to all of the rest. So let's just try and make that visible here by having a selected element, and I'm just going to throw up a decision here of a particular type. Select the unpriced element. Now, this decision is pink because it does not output to the schema, to the document that the schema represents. It is in fact a decision that's consumed within the model. And I'll make that clear in a moment. What I'm just doing here is setting up some decisions here, so that's more or less correct. So you can see here that I have a series of decisions within this group. The decision that is coloured in pink here will determine whether I execute these or not. That's its purpose. So it is a decision, but it's consumed. It's not output. So let's see how that's done. We'll now just put a new formula on there. Now, as I mentioned, it's a decision that will either exit the group or it will do nothing, and aborting the decision is doing nothing. The condition on which it will do that is if the code is a valid node, it will exit because it's already been priced. So that decision is now done, and we'll move on to the maximum number of lines of code, which is the most complicated formula in this set. Now what we need to do here, and for our particular pricing model, we only charge for the new lines of code, and so we need to know how many lines we've already generated in the past for the same decision model. It's not the total number of lines, it's actually the maximum number of lines that we have generated in the past. So we need to select some elements out of the collection because we're not going to look at all of them. For instance, we don't want to look at elements that are for a different decision model. There's some we don't want to look at, we'll skip those. And when we do find one that we want to consider, we want to look at its lines of code. Now, in order to determine the records that we want to look at, we've got a couple of conditions, both of which have to be true in this case. One of them is that we only want to look at previously priced ones. My mistake, we actually want to have only the valid node one. Now, the second condition here is a little more complex. We need to compare the decision model that is currently in context. This is on the unpriced record because that's our context, with the decision model ID in the collection that we're cycling through. So we need to step back to the collection, step outside of the context of this formula to the previous context, and we want the decision model ID. So there we are. We have done that formula now, and we're ready to continue. Now, the next one I wanted to show you was the new generation cost formula. However, we don't have it here, so we need to go back and add it. So let's add the new generation cost attribute, which is a decimal. It's optional. We're done. We can save that. We go back to our decision model. We need to acquire that change. So we need to re-import Schema. We'll just have a look at the view again, and then we'll see that we go to the node visibility. We have our new Schema. We have our output view. We'll add it there so we can output to it. And we're done. Now it's going to save and shut down the decision model, bearing in mind that if you have the full license version, there may be multiple decision models open against this particular schema. So we've updated all of that, and we now have our field available, the decision, and we're ready to go. Now this formula going to take the difference between the lines of code that I currently have and the previous maximum. We need to divide that by 1,000 to get the lines of code per 1,000. And we need to multiply it 10. And we're done. So we can shut that down now, and we're ready for some testing. Now we think it's very important that the decision designer does their own testing, because we've actually already got flaws in this design. So I've now opened up the test engine. We need 2 generated code elements, so I'll just add another one. The first one will say had 2,000 lines of code, which is about the size actually of the real pricing model. And the new one has 3,000 lines of code, and away we go. So we've now tested that. We've calculated the cost of $10, which is all correct, except that it's a sunny day test. What happens if we put 1,000 lines of code there, and we would get an error? Well, we would get an invalid result. So we really do need to test this with a reasonably considered set of test data. However, we've now seen enough to get you started, I think. We have pulled in the schemas, we've modified the schemas, we've built some formulas, we've built some reasonably complex formulas in fact, and we've tested them. So that was our intent today. I hope you found it interesting. Don't forget all the resources can be found on our website at www.idiomsoftware.com. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again.
I hope you enjoyed our presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us through the details on our website.